Sitting US President Joe Biden recently quickly wrapped up a trip in one of the strategic countries in Southeast Asia, which is Vietnam. It shouldn't be a surprise the US has been investing and also dedicating so much, politically speaking, and also from this economic standpoint, within the nations in Southeast Asia. And of course, how should we understand behind the motivation under President Biden to his visit to the nation of Vietnam? And also, during the meeting, I believe there's something what we called comprehensive strategic partnership. What did that say between the two leaders? But meanwhile, President Biden believed by visiting Vietnam, they also sent a strong message to the nation of China and Russia at the same time. Does that mean Vietnam today is the focal point when we look at this tough relationship between China and the US at this moment? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you follow our show, you should be familiar with our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Hai Hong Nguyen. Again, Dr. Hai is currently a senior lecturer of politics and social change and international relations. He is a political scientist and experienced lecturer, also researcher in politics and international relationships. Well, Dr. Hai, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you. Thank you, Will.
Dr. Hai, again, as we mentioned before, sitting US President Joe Biden recently wrapped up his trip in Vietnam. Now, let's get to the first question right away. Now, between the two leaders, of course, that dialogue took place. And also, we realize there's so much to unpack at this moment. But meanwhile, let's dive into the three keywords, what we called comprehensive strategic partnership. Dr. Hai, so you're the expert. From your standpoint, how should we understand the trip for Biden to Vietnam this time? And also, what does that mean when we say the two countries signed this comprehensive strategic partnership? Your thoughts?
Thank you, Will. Thank you for such a very good timing questions, particularly on the heels of President Joe Biden visits to Vietnam. And I completely understand that the upgrading of the relationship between Vietnam and the United States still, drawing a lot of attention from the international community at the moment. So, as I said, question is very interesting and very good timing. So, as you know, President Biden has just concluded his 1.5-day visits to Vietnam at the state level for the first time at the invitation by the Communist Party of Vietnam's General Secretary Nguyen So many people said that this is a historic moment, historic event, because this is the first time a U.S. president accepted and make an official visits at the invitations of the Communist Party's chief. So, of course, as everyone knows that during the visits, the two leaders made the official announcements of the upgrade of their relations to the strategic, comprehensive strategic partnership. Now, let me just want to emphasize that this kind of partnership is the top tier in Vietnam diplomacy. As you pointed out, there are three keywords: comprehensive, strategic, and partnership. So strategic, of course, this is a very, important level in the diplomatic hierarchies of Vietnam. And comprehensive, that means its own embracing own areas of collaborations and cooperations. Or even we can say is a level of cooperation without limit. And partnership, of course, it is more than a friendship. So this is very important. And of course, in the Vietnam diplomatic tier, it begins with a regular diplomatic relations. The second tier is comprehensive partnership. The third one is strategic partnership. So the fourth one is comprehensive strategic partnership. Now, back in 2013, Vietnam and the United States established the comprehensive partnerships. That means the second tier. Now they established and upgraded their relationship to comprehensive strategic partnerships. That means they forklift two levels, right? So that really reflects the trust, the level of trust between the two countries, between the two former enemies. This is more important. And from in terms of the outcome of the visits, I can point out 5 key takeaways from the Biden's trip. The first one is, as I said, is a formal recognition, formal upgrade of the relationship from the comprehensive partnerships to comprehensive strategic partnership. It really, now with that kind of level of trust and partnership, Vietnam put the US now on the same footing or the same bar with the other partners that Vietnam have. They include China, Russia, India, and South Korea. And of course, it's significant for both countries because it also sent out a strong message to the outside world and to other partners in the region that it really want to have a strategic balance between and amongst major powers. It also want to emphasize that now they don't want to choose side. They want to have an equal relationship with all major powers. The second takeaway is the comprehensive strategic partnership emphasized and pointed out the important areas of collaborations between the two countries. And of course, first of all, it built on the 9 areas of cooperations between the two countries that already established in the comprehensive partnerships 10 years ago. And of course, this time, with the comprehensive strategic partnership, it also expanded to cover important areas or emerging areas such as semiconductor productions and response to climate change and of course other. This is important for Vietnam, because Vietnam already made a commitment by 2050 they will bring the net zero emission. So between now and 2015, the time is not long enough for Vietnam to achieve that commitment, and that's why the U.S. assistance and support to Vietnam in order for the countries to achieve the goal is very important. Of course, Vietnam very much relied on the financial resources from the United States. The third key takeaway is the economic trade and investment collaboration. As the Vietnamese Prime Minister in his meeting with President Biden, he emphasized that economic collaborations should be the permanent or long-lasting pillar in the bilateral relationship. So this is important. And if we look at the statistic and the data in terms of trades and economics or investment between the two countries, it is an amazing one. Last year's Vietnam export to the US achieved more than $330 billion. And Vietnam becomes the 8th largest trading partners of the United States. And of course, the United States is the largest export market for Vietnam goods. So this is very important. And with the new partnership framework, then it will have more opportunity for the two countries to boost their economic trade and investment. And more importantly, it also laid out the framework for Vietnam businesses investments in the US. So last year's Vietnam's has one company who made 4 billions US dollars in building a car makers, electric cars, vehicle makers, manufacturing factories in North Carolina, and also it also registers on the state stock market in New York recently. Now, the fourth key takeaway is the strengthening of the people-to-people relationship, particularly with a focus on addressing the legacy of wars. I think this is very important. And then the leaders of the countries emphasize that addressing the legacy of war will be a pillar in order to strengthen the trust between the two countries. And the last one is that if we look at carefully and read carefully the wordings of the comprehensive strategic partnerships, I think both the US and Vietnam sent out to the reasons that, first of all, on the US side, it wants to emphasize that, well, by strengthening its relationship and partnership with Vietnam, it clearly showed that the US didn't have a strong commitment to the regions, and its interest still anchor in the regions. And that's why the President Joe Biden said the US is a Pacific nation, and it won't go anywhere. Now, for Vietnam also want to send out a clear message to the regions that, well, we collaborate with the US. It's not aiming or targeting at any partner or at anyone, or in other words, it is not going to, be siding with the US to against with any countries in the regions. But it is a framework, a partnership for peace, cooperations, and sustainable development. That's also reflected in the discussions of ASEAN leaders in ASEAN summits and East Asian summits recently held in Jakarta, Indonesia, too.
Dr. Hai,
So
again,
these are, yeah.
sure. Again, thank you for explaining those key points. But let's move on with the conversation. Again, as we mentioned before, you're the expert of international relationships, and clearly, one thing that we cannot deny is the current political atmosphere within the U.S. It's rather more complex and more intricate. So, in other words, when we look at the foreign policy, when we look at the strategic relationship between U.S. with some countries in Southeast Asia, at this moment, it's, again, we can use the phrase called stick and carrot. Now, let me ask you a very simple question, Dr. Hai. Why should Vietnam to trust the relationship with the U.S. if U.S. foreign policy at this moment, when we're looking at dealing with Vietnam, dealing with Philippines or any other countries, are really in this uncertainty? So don't you think that the Vietnam today, it's actually playing, again, I want to be careful, it's not a dangerous bet. It's placing uncertain or ambiguous bet in the basket of the U.S. So in other words, we've seen the foreign policy in the U.S. playing back and forth like a ping pong game. So why does Vietnam trust the U.S. at this moment when we look at this strategic partnership? It sounds great, but how do we know the U.S. is going to deliver the promise? Your thoughts?
Well, I completely understand the concerns from countries around the world, particularly when we look at U.S. commitment to other regions. More particularly, I also understand that comes from, as you said, domestic politics and also foreign policy, particularly after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. So I completely understand that. But I think, and it has been emphasized by the U.S. administrations, whether it's under the Democratic or under the Republicans, I think old U.S. administration has emphasized that the U.S. is a Pacific nation. And it has been echoed as message before by President Biden that the U.S. is a nation in the Pacific. It won't go anywhere. Well, actually, this is not something that recent U.S. administration have realized or have emphasized that it is a Pacific nation. It has been by the U.S. governments, back even 1930s, long before that, it already emphasized that the U.S. interest is vested with the Pacific. So I think whether it will be a Democrat administration or a Republican administration, the U.S. still put a lot of efforts and still have its interest vested in the Pacific. And of course, we all understand that the U.S. foreign policy is, might be changed, but the interest, I don't think it will change, and more particularly, the interest in the regions. What I mean here is the core interest, the national interest. The U.S. national interest, I think, is really much invested in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific. So I think even though there's up and downs in the U.S. foreign policy, but also still the U.S. play a very important role in the region. And it has been recognized by ASEAN and also by other countries in the region. And that's why countries in the region always encourage and call for the U.S. to stay in the regions. And it can play the roles as a counterbalance against, some forces that are trying to influence in the regions. More particularly now, we can say, frankly, China is trying to, insert its influence in the regions and try to establish its own rules and, new rules in the regions. And look at what is happening in the South China Sea, or in the East, etc. So there's a big concern, from regional countries. And for Vietnam, I think, of course, Vietnam is one of the claimants in the South China Sea. And of course, Vietnam fully understands its capabilities, requirements. And that's why Vietnam really want to have other major powers to play a bigger role in the regions in order to keep a strategic balance and stability in the regions. And I think with what's happening now between Russia and Ukraine, who else at the moment can play that kind of roles in the regions? So and of course. Many people say, well, the American democracy is declining, but well, somehow we agree, but it's not going to die. So even though it's declining, but it's not going to die, and it won't die soon, or and that's why it's still a strong major power in the regions, and it still play a very important, it is still a major part in keeping the region stable. So that's why I think establishing a comprehensive strategic partnership with the United States is a strategic decision of the Vietnamese government in order to get more support from the U.S. from economic point of view, from the technology point of view. I think that is how Vietnam see the benefits from upgrading the relationship with the United States. Particularly, it will help Vietnam to achieve what the Communist Party of Vietnam has set. They are the two centenary goals. That means by 2030, it will become by the time Vietnam celebrate the 100th anniversaries of the establishment of the Communist Party in Vietnam. So the country is going to become a developing countries with a modern industries and high incomes. And the second centenary goal is by 2045. That means when the countries celebrate the 100th anniversaries of the establishment of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, it will become a developed countries and with high income. So these are the very important two centenaries goals for Vietnam, because with now achieving that kind of goals, it won't have the enough capabilities to protect its sovereignty, and it can't be a strong, prosperous, and resilient nation within the context where the competition between major powers is still going on, and when China is still flexing its muscle and implementing aggressive action in the South China Sea.
Dr. Hai, I know you're very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Now let's talk about China. During the press conference that President Biden made a statement rather crystal clear to the media and also to the world when he was questioned regarding the threat from China or the pressure from China. This is what he said, and I want to get your reaction on this. And I quote, "I don't want to contain China. I just want to make sure that we have a relationship with China that is on the up and up." Now, clearly we'll understand that the relationship, particularly from this economic standpoint, it's rather competitive between China and US. Politically speaking, this is a deadlock between the two countries, despite the higher officials have paid a visit to China, but so far, fewer progress have been made. Now, at this moment, another piece of reality, Dr. Hai, you know this as well, that China is also influencing this economic agenda for Vietnam as well. As I mentioned in the intro, I want to get your reaction. Is Vietnam today a testing lab for the relationship between US and China at this moment? And also, of course, no country, as we mentioned before, will like to take side because that's a difficult choice. But at this moment, how should Vietnam react to this deadlock or the competition between US and China? And also, by seeing the visit of Joe Biden, is that a clear message to China to say, hey, listen, I think we got a partner while you might just lose another one? Your thoughts?
So that's very interesting question, Will. And I would say it's a very difficult question too. With that kind of very difficult questions, people can't get a clear answer for it. But I will try. I agree that with President Biden. And I even want to say that it's very hard to contain China. No one can contain China. It's the fact. And China's growth is unavoidable. And no one can contain it. And no one, of course, want to contain it. As long as we want to see that China's rise more peacefully. Actually, that's what China said years ago. But unfortunately, with what it has been doing in the South China Sea and in other parts of the world, the perceptions of peaceful, development or growth of China is no more, effective in the eyes of the international community anymore. But yeah, as I said, China growth, China development, China influence, etc., is the fact, and no one, of course, can contain it. And what people can do is that if we try to, of course, live up with that kind of growth of China's. And in order to live with that kind of growth, it's the better to prepare for the worst. And I think Vietnamese people is a good position to understand what is need to do in order to prepare for the worst. And of course, Vietnam. Apparently, Vietnam is still, technically, Vietnam is still, is conflict with China. Of course, China is now occupying the islands that it used force to take away from Vietnam back in 1970, and of course, still have occupying some islands in the Spratly Islands, and of course, still have the disputes over the sovereignty in the South China Seas. So technically, the two countries are still, at conflict. Of course, no one can deny that. But of course, diplomatically, Vietnam want to have a good relationship with China, want to have a peaceful relationship with China, and of course now Vietnam also, on the other hand, it must be prepared well enough in order to protect its sovereignty, and that's why it also have to reach out. Well, the United States is not the only one that Vietnam has established comprehensive strategic partnership, right? So as I mentioned, so far it has established comprehensive strategic partnership with other four countries, including China, so India, South Korea, and of course it's going to upgrade comprehensive strategic partnership with some other countries, including Indonesia, Singapore, and Australia, and of course Japan too. So having said that, it does not mean upgrading the relationship with the United States to the level of comprehensive strategic partnership is going to take side with the United States against China, and vice versa. Vietnam don't want to too much dependent on China's economic relations. And of course, at the moment, Vietnam still suffering, trade surplus with China. Vietnam's import more from China rather than export more. On the other hand, Vietnam export more to the U.S. rather than import from the U.S. So we can see here Vietnam try to keep the balance, economically balanced, politically balanced, and strategically balanced. So regardless the competition between China and the U.S., for Vietnam, it is important to hold off and put its national interest first, where it can see in what kind of relationship it can see that it can enjoy and protect the national interest. Then it will promote the relationship with that partner. So regardless China's or the US, it doesn't matter. Vietnam is now foreign policies now is to put national interest first. And probably people have heard about bamboo diplomacy. So having a relationship upgraded with the United States to comprehensive strategic partnership on the one hand, and of course having the comprehensive cooperative strategic partnership with China on the other hand is a clear testament of bamboo diplomacy of Vietnam.
Well, again, Dr. Hai, you're the expert on international relationship. And again, as we mentioned before, the visit paid by Joe Biden to the nation of Vietnam, it's crucial not only for the country of US and also for Vietnam as well. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Hai Hong Nguyen. Again, Dr. Hai is currently a senior lecturer of politics, social change, and international relationship. Again, he's the specialist and also experienced researcher in politics and also international relations. Well, Dr. Hai, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your analysis and insights. And every time we talk to you, it's so enlightening and also so, we'll say, beneficial to our audience on our show. We thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to the relationship, not just between US and Vietnam, but also the relationship around the world. So thank you so much for doing this.